Welcome to part two of lesson six, Marxian capitalism, a model of state-sanctioned dual monopolies. In this video, you're instructed to read a paragraph and then answer the question the best you can. One of the responses is the correct answer. The other five are close. So it's very important to read the paragraph carefully. We're going to go down to the model itself, modeling Marxism with modern tools. Marx argued that capitalists extract surplus value. That is, workers create more value during production than they receive in wages, and the excess becomes profit for the capitalist class. This surplus arises because the price of labor, or wages, merely covers the cost of sustaining the worker and reproducing labor power. While the worker's productivity generates output worth far more than those subsistence costs. Writing before the development of modern algebraic supply and demand tools, or equilibrium diagrams, Marx approached economics as a study of social relations and power dynamics rather than mathematical interactions between curves. His focus was on how the organization of production under capitalism systematically transfers value from labor to capital, transforming living labor into accumulated profit. In this unit, we translate these social relations into analytical form by using linear demand and supply functions to represent production and exchange, calculate the surplus numerically, and explore how alternative ownership structures, such as worker cooperatives, might internalize that surplus, aligning incentives between labor and capital rather than dividing them. In the twilight of European feudalism, the king stood atop a vast pyramid of privilege. With a stroke of the quill, he issued royal charters, legal instruments that transformed a guild of weavers in London into sanctioned monopolists. These charters were not gifts but contracts in exchange for exclusive rights to produce and sell within a defined territory. The guild or firm remitted a fixed annual payment to the crown, guaranteed export quality, and pledged loyalty in times of war. The guildmaster, now a state-appointed monopolist in cloth, faced no rival workshops. The chartered merchant, a monopolist in trade, faced no competing ships. Beneath them, journeymen and apprentices were bound by guild statutes that capped wages, forbade independent labor, and stretched apprenticeships into decades. The king's revenue flowed, the realm's bullion reserves swelled, and the guildmaster's profits fattened. This was Europe's dual monopoly, one that unified control over both the product market and the labor market, with the state as silent partner. Across the 18th century, Enlightenment critiques and revolutionary upheaval began to erode this structure. In France, the night of August 4, 1789, swept away feudal privileges. Yet the logic of monopoly did not vanish. It evolved. Within a few years, bankers in Paris required police permits to operate. By 1795, butchers, pharmacists, and printers needed stamped brevets. Napoleon's Code de Commerce institutionalized the transition. Every enterprise had to register, and public or dangerous trades, food, arms, transport, required explicit prefectural licenses. These licenses were not neutral. They awarded to firms that could supply the army, pay higher fees, or maintain political favor. The guildmaster had become the licensed entrepreneur. The apparatus of control remained. Entry barriers, quotas, and state oversight now enforced through bureaucracy rather than parchment charter. In the German territories, the transition from guild monopolies to regulated trade associations occurred gradually but deliberately. Prussian edicts of 1810 to 1811 weakened compulsory guild status, yet guilds reemerged as voluntary organizations that continue to restrict entry through certification, apprenticeship, and membership to sustain insider wages. The trade restrictions of 1845 placed guild monopolies with municipal concession, which means concession, requiring proof of capital, training, and moral character. While the Handwerks Ordnung of 1897 restored the Meisterbrief, reserving workshops and training rights for certified masters. Handwerksmen, dominated by established craftsmen, acted as a new gatekeeper, collecting fees and enforcing standards under Reich laws. Meanwhile, heavy industries such as steel, chemicals, and electricity relied on state-issued permits and costly compliance rules that excluded small producers and protected firms like Krupp and Siemens. Across crafts and industry alike, state authority underpinned monopoly power, controlling labor through licensing and goods through selective authorization. Although guilds lost former privileges, their successors maintained the same incentives, limiting entry, suppressing competition, and preserving a dual monopoly over labor and production, now justified in the bureaucratic language of safety, skill, and national efficiency. Karl Marx, writing in the British Museum during the 1850s and 1860s, observed this continuum. In Paris, he observed the licensed printer hemmed in by prefectural regulation. In the Rhineland, he saw the Meisterbrow reduce skilled journeymen to permanent wage laborers. The form had changed, charters replaced by licenses, guild wardens by chamber presidents, but the substance persisted. A single economic actor determining both the price of commodities and the price of labor. The state, whether absolutist or bureaucratic, remained guarantor of monopoly rent. This was the soil from which Marxian capitalism emerged, not from free competition, but from state-sanctioned restriction. Karl Marx wrote in an era before formal equations, indifference curves, or the marginalist revolution pioneered by Karl Menger in 1871. He had no access to now ubiquitous tools of modern microeconomics, linear demand schedules, marginal revenue curves, or the profit maximizing condition of marginal revenue equals marginal cost. His analysis unfolded through dialectical reasoning, historical narrative, and verbal logic, not from mathematical formalism. What follows is a deliberate modern quantitative translation of the economic regime Marx observed, state-sanctioned dual monopoly. First under royal charters granting exclusive product rights to guilds and trading companies, then evolving into bureaucratic licensing systems in post-revolutionary France and imperial Germany. Using linear models of product monopoly and labor monopsony, we compute equilibrium prices, quantities, wages, and employment levels in a representative wool cloth workshop. These numerical outcomes are then interpreted through a Marxian lens. As lived exploitation, surplus extraction, and structural barriers to working class advancement, precisely as a 19th century observer in Paris or Manchester might have experienced them. Berlin was part of the Kingdom of Prussia when Karl Marx attended the University of Berlin, then known as Frederick William University. During his student years, a pound of wool in Berlin cost roughly 1 thaler and 246 pfennige. Since the English words dollar and penny are Anglicized versions of German words, thaler and pfennig, respectively, the prices in the models below will be in US pennies. The demand for and supply of wool cloth are given below. Because this represents positive slope, and this is negative slope. This is the demand equation, and this is the supply equation. German firms hire workers from a local guild to process raw wool purchased from suppliers into cloth. The guild regulates the supply of its members' labor. This determines the slope and intercept of labor supply. The following labor supply equation represents the reservation wage of workers, a range from the most desperate worker, lowest reservation wage, to the least desperate, highest reservation wage. For Marx, these are subsistence wages, the bare minimum required for workers to survive and reproduce their labor power. The guildmaster, using his experience in guild records, knows the values intimately and exploits this knowledge by hiring only those willing to accept the lowest pay. Create a monopoly over labor in which the guild collectively sells its members' labor. This arrangement exemplifies Marx's critique of exploitation under what I call Marxian capitalism, a system in which state-sanctioned monopolies suppress competition and concentrate power. In modern terms, such state capitalism or corporatism systematically depresses wages, transforming the surplus value created by labor to guildmasters and the state. The demand for labor is this. It is the most a firm is willing to pay for a given amount of hours of labor. Supply of labor is given by this. It represents the reservation wages from the worker with the lowest reservation wage on the left to the worker with the highest reservation wage on the right. In a Prussian economy, Prussia was the forerunner of Germany. free from government intervention, a condition that never existed during Karl Marx's lifetime, there would have been no legal barriers restricting entry into labor or product markets. Individuals could have pursued their own ambitions and passions, supplying labor or starting businesses as they pleased. Anyone might have established a wool cloth enterprise or any other venture without license, Meisterbriefs, or state approvals. Likewise, workers could have offered their skills to any employer, whether in weaving, brewing, or carpentry, without guilds or chambers imposing wage controls, training requirements, or employment terms. In such an unfettered market, labor and capital would have moved freely according to individual initiative and competitive demand. In today's world of mathematical and spreadsheet modeling, we can do what Marx and his contemporaries could not. Simulate this direct world of pure competition to establish benchmarks for comparison. Using this model, which I've opened over here, the market clearing price for wool cloth is what? The quantity supplied of that cloth is what? And the quantity demanded is what? We need to copy these equations here. The intersection of product demand and product supply gives a market clearing price of 23.3 pennies per pound. The quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are the same. There is no excess supply and there is no excess demand. The invisible hand works in a market free of government planning, regulation, management, ownership. Demand and supply will want to equal themselves at the market clearing price. Now I'm going to open up this model here. I'm going to grab the equations, the numbers and the subtraction symbol for demand, and then I'll grab the numbers with the addition symbol for supply. In a market free of government intervention, licensing, restrictions, whatnot, laborers and firms can freely negotiate the terms of service. All the labor that is demanded will equal the labor supplied at the market clearing wage. The market clearing wage here is 109 pennies per week. That doesn't seem like a lot, but back then that was a lot of money. The hours of labor supplied is this number. I'm going to go ahead and just copy it. Control C if you have a PC, Command C if you have a Mac, and then I'll paste it here as well. So markets clear when there is no licensing, no state approvals, no regulations, and people are free to supply whatever they want, whether it's labor or products, and free to contract with other consenting adults. A world that Karl Marx did not observe. The bilateral labor monopoly, legacy of mercantilism and serfdom. In the 19th century, Central Europe's restrictive labor institutions, guilds, and state-regulated journeymen's associations did more than structure class relations. They deepened workers' alienation from their craft, their product, and one another. You can actually see that in this series by Taylor Sheridan, 1883, which is a prequel to the Kevin Costner TV series Yellowstone. It is set during America's westward expansion. This history becomes human, where Eastern European artisans, long confined by guild monopolies that rationed jobs, fixed wages, and required costly apprenticeships and honorable birth, fled a system that fractured the unity of labor and purpose. These artisans, or these workers in Prussia at the time, according to this series, weren't even allowed to swim. So when they got to the American West and they had to swim across the river, they feared for their life because they had never swam before, because swimming was against the law in Prussia. Even after the Stein-Hardenberg reforms promised freedom of trade, Prussian workers remained bound. Journeymen's associations and early unions were state-controlled, and strikes were outlawed. These institutions preserved the guild logic of limiting labor supply to protect insiders while excluding migrants and women, perpetuating the exploitation and estrangement Marx described. On the American frontier, by contrast, the immigrants encountered not only personal liberty, but a chance to reclaim labor's collective meaning. In building towns, cooperatives, and mutual aid networks, they glimpsed the communal solidarity Marx imagined as the cure for alienation. A world where work reconnected to purpose, production to community, and survival to shared effort rather than corporate privilege. In the Eastern European economies that Marx observed, state-sanctioned labor institutions, whether the traditional guilds or their later successors, functioned as monopoly sellers of labor within their respective trades. These institutions effectively controlled entry, apprenticeship, and wages, ensuring that most workers earned what modern economists would call the reservation wage and what Marx described as the subsistence wage, the minimal compensation necessary for survival and reproduction of labor power. For simplicity, we refer to this monopoly seller of labor as the guild. In many one-factory towns, the factory served as the sole purchaser of labor, creating a monopsony structure in which the firm possessed the power to pay workers no more than their subsistence wages, yet was compelled to negotiate with the guild, the monopolist supplier of labor. In this system, the guild master, a cousin of a royal perhaps, a monopoly seller of the guild labor, and the owner of a factory, a grandson of a royal maybe, determine the quantity of labor employed and the wage paid to the workers. This negotiation involves the guild's marginal revenue and the factory owner's marginal cost. To find the equation of the guild's marginal revenue, we need to determine the guild's total revenue. Since the guild master has decades of experience, he has an intuitive understanding of what he thinks the factory owner is willing to pay for various hours of work that guild members will supply. This intuitive feeling is the labor demand equation. In my case, 181.1 minus 0.002, which is here and given up here. Multiplying the right-hand side of the above equation by H is our quantity, W is the price of each hour of labor, so W times H is a revenue, the revenue of the guild, the price of that quantity, that price of that output, times the output. So inside the parentheses, we're going to replace W with what the guild master has an intuitive feel for, the firm's maximum willingness to pay for labor at each quantity of labor, hours supplied. So the thing in the parentheses is the right-hand side of the labor demand equation. When we multiply the stuff inside the parentheses by H, we have to distribute the H here and here. When we multiply 180.1 times H, we get the linear component. And then when we multiply the H by this coefficient times H, we get the quadratic component. The guild's marginal revenue is found by differentiating its revenue equation with respect to H. Doing that yields linear marginal revenue that has an intercept equal to labor's demand and a slope that is twice as steep as labor demand. So we're going to multiply that by 2. When you multiply the labor demand slope by 2, you get 0.004. If the factory owner lacked a state-granted monopoly, he would possess no market power, and the guild master could freely supply what hours of labor at what wage. So we have the labor demand equation here, and we have the marginal revenue equation here for the guild. Though guild master knows this, has a really good feeling for what the most the firm will pay for a quantity of labor. I'm going to use R for guild's marginal revenue. I'm going to copy the equation here, and then I'm going to multiply the slope by 2, and I get 0.004. I'm going to change that color to red. Okay, so if the firm has no power at all, and it's broken up into many, many different firms, and they have no power, privilege to negotiate from, the guild master has all the power. And what the guild master will do, the guild maximizes its profit. It's selling these workers to the firm, and it's going to tell the firm, we're going to supply 23,700 hours of labor. And the subsistence wage is the reservation wage of the last guild member allowed into the guild. And that is 85.3 pennies per week. The workers are getting paid the subsistence wage that Marx would have considered exploitative. And I agree with Marx on that. It is exploitative. A modern labor union would give the worker something closer to the labor demand curve. And then the worker ideally would get the surplus. The guild master, acting as an intermediary, could then extract a fee. So let me do this. Let me put the quantity as equal to X, 23,700, to produce the vertical line. At the hours of labor the guild was going to supply the firms, I'm going to change this to a dashed line and then to black, and then I'll shrink the width of it down. So this is the subsistence wage of the last member of the guild. And this is the maximum the firms would be willing to pay for that quantity of labor. So the guildmaster is going to charge the firms that number of pennies per week. And then the guildmaster is going to pay its members this per week. So this difference is the guildmaster's take. The guildmaster is taking the firm's surplus, the employer surplus, and taking worker surplus, multiplying that by this quantity here to get the total amount it extracts from both the firms and the workers. And I would agree with Marx that this is exploitative. And this is, I think, what Marx was getting at. So the fee is 47.4 pennies per week, which doesn't seem like a lot. When you multiply that 47.4 times 23,700 hours the guild supplies, that is what the guildmaster is extracting from both the firms and the workers. And this guild is a corporation chartered by the state. So this would be an evil capitalist in the mind of Marx, but not in the way I think of a capitalist. We think of a capitalist, at least I do, as a person, an entrepreneur in an unrigged system. No state subsidy, no licenses, no permissions, no taxation. Rolling the dice and opening a business and having to face competitors at home and abroad. That's what I consider a capitalist. But to Marx, a capitalist was a person who had this state authority, this state protection from competition. Only he could supply the product or labor, in this case, the guildmaster. And they extracted substantial amounts from both the worker and the firm, if the firms were competing for this labor competitively. Now, as the monopoly buyer of labor, however, the factory owner in a one-factory town, if you want to know more about one-factory towns, watch this trailer or watch this trailer. They're both fascinating. They must negotiate directly with the guildmaster to determine how much labor will be employed and what wage will be paid. To understand that, watch episode 2 of this Netflix series. The series is about football, what we call soccer. But at the time when soccer was being formulated and made official by the English crown, there was a debate. Should only the elites be allowed to participate in competition? Or should they allow workers to form teams and compete against the privileged sons of nobles and aristocrats? Fascinating Netflix series. This negotiation involves an interplay between the guild's marginal revenue from labor and the factory owner's marginal expense of labor. To determine the latter, we first derive the total wage bill. Having decades of experience, the owner intuitively understands the reservation wages of workers in the community, what Marx described as, again, subsistence level wages, which vary by marital status, family obligations, and debt. This intuitive feeling is modeled by the labor supply curve, which I have right here, 37.9 plus 0.002. It's also up here, right? Your version's right there. Now, multiplying the right-hand side of this equation by quantity H gives the factory owner's wage bill. Think about it. If you hire 1,000 hours of labor at $10 an hour, 10 times 1,000 is $10,000. So that would be the firm's wage bill. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace W with what it equals. Here's the parentheses. And what does W equal? It equals 37.9 plus 0.02 H. And then we're going to multiply this by H, and we're going to multiply this by H. Multiplying this by H gives us the linear term. Multiplying this by H times 0.02 gives us the quadratic term. The factory's marginal cost of labor is found by differentiating this labor cost equation with respect to H. Doing that yields linear marginal cost that has an intercept equal to labor's supply intercept and twice as steep as labor supply. So we're going to multiply that by 2. If we multiply that by 2, we get 0.004. If the guildmaster did not possess a state-granted monopoly, he would have no market power. So I'm going to turn off the red line. Then I'm going to add the firm's marginal cost line. I'm going to click plus here. So the firm's marginal cost line, I'm going to just call it little c, it's going to equal to 37.9 plus 0.002h. But I got to multiply that by 4 because it has twice the slope as labor supply. Now these can be L or H. I'll change them all to H to be consistent. I will change the this to red. So this equation here is this red upward sloping line. It has the same intercept as the labor supply, but it is twice as steep as labor supply. If the guildmaster does not possess a state-granted monopoly, he would have no market power. And the factory owner could do what? Well, the factory owner would maximize his profits, where this marginal cost equation crosses labor demand. He'd want to hire 23,700 hours of labor, where each member of the labor force, because there's no guild, would be getting paid 85.3 pennies per week. Even though the factory owner would be willing to pay what? 132.7 pennies per week. So again, this is what Marx referred to as the exploitation of the worker, because the owner of this factory is the only employer in a one factory town. That factory has monopoly power and can pay workers their reservation wage. If this monopsonist pays just 85.3 pennies per week, it can get 23,700 hours of labor out of the workers in this small town. And it's paying them a subsistence wage of 85.3. And it has grabbed all the worker surplus. This value here is worker surplus. So its surplus originally from this point and up is made larger because the firm, this evil corporatist, is grabbing all this surplus and paying workers just 85.3 pennies per week. And again, I agree, that is exploitative. Now here's the rub. If there were no state protections for this monopoly buyer of labor, what would happen is other factories would see that the wage was only 85.3 in this one factory town. And guess what they would do? They would move to this one factory town and compete against the original firm. There would end up being two factories in this town. And you only need one competitor, and the wage that these workers are going to get is going to rise to this point here. But this monopoly buyer of labor has state protection. Only it can operate in this one factory town, which gives it monopoly power over labor. Again, Marx isn't critiquing, in my opinion, markets that are completely free of government intervention. He's not critiquing the free exchange economy. He's critiquing this state monopolized economy where the state creates and protects monopolies because the king wants his taxes. And the guilds and the factories agree to collect the taxes on behalf of the king. So the king gives the guilds and the factories these monopolies. If the guildmaster and factory owner possess equal privileges and monopoly powers, powers granted and protected by the state, they have to compromise. The one factory town, monopoly buyer of labor, wants to hire that many hours of labor from the labor pool in this town, even though it'd be willing to pay 132.7 per week per worker, it only wants to pay the workers 85.3 pennies per week. The guild wants to sell 23,700 hours of labor a week to this firm, pay its members just 85.3 pennies per week so that it can charge the firm 132.7 pennies per week for these hours of work demanded. So in this situation, firms want this outcome, the guildmaster wants this outcome, and they have equal power under the state. With equal power under the state, they'll split the difference. The guildmaster is only going to supply 23,700 hours. Remember, the guildmaster was extracting a fee of 47.4 pennies per week, which will be split equally between the guildmaster and the firm because the state has given them equal power. The result of this negotiation, made possible only through the coercive authority of the state, reduces total worker surplus to what? If the state didn't bestow monopoly powers to both the factory and the guildmaster, and the workers could freely supply their labor however they wanted, and firms could enter and exit at will, what would happen is we'd have this equilibrium right here. And so what we need to do here is we need to put in a line here, y equal to the competitive wage of 109. I need to turn off the two red lines, and then I'm going to get rid of this. So in a world where there is no privilege and power bestowed by the king upon elites in this economy, this lower triangle is the worker surplus, and this upper triangle is the firm surplus. And I've made the model in a way where the slopes are the same to make the math easier. We need to compute the worker surplus that would prevail if there were no monopoly privileges and power granted to the guilds and the factories. It is the area of this triangle which has a height equal to the competitive wage 109 minus the reservation wage of the most desperate of the people in the community, 37.9. This might be a 16-year-old citizen of this town who has no children. He needs 37.9 pennies per week to just survive and not starve to death. So that's the height of this lower triangle. The width of the triangle is the employment level at the competitive equilibrium, 35,550. That would be the area of this rectangle here. A triangle is half that. So we're going to divide this by 2. Worker surplus would be this value. And this is the worker surplus that would prevail in a world, in an economy, where the king does not bestow any privileges and monopoly power to any individual, guild, or factory owner. So total worker surplus would be 1.263802.5 pennies per week under the competitive outcome, with no state granted privileges given to anyone. But that's not the case here, is it? The employment level falls to 23,700 labor hours the guild says it will supply to the one factory town. This 109 here is the amount that the factory owner will pay the guild master for all of this labor. The guild master is only paying his members 85.3 pennies per week. So the guild master is collecting the difference, 109 minus the 85.3. So I need to create a new line at this wage given to the members of the guild, the subsistence wage. And I do the same thing for the amount that firms would pay this labor. The most they'd be willing to pay for this amount of labor is 132.7. And then I'm going to make the red lines disappear. And I'm going to change the color of these two lines to black, make them dashed, and make the width 1. Black, dashed, and width 1. So now we have the guild masters. We have the guild masters surplus, this amount. This is extracted from the workers in this grand negotiation with the owner of the one factory in the town. If there was no guild master and the workers collectively agreed on this 109 wage at this amount of hours per week, then this trapezoid right here would go all to the workers. And you could say the workers weren't being exploited. And then this trapezoid up here would be the employer surplus going to the guy that owned the factory in this one factory town. Instead, we have a guild master. The guild master takes this rectangle from his members, takes the rectangle here. The members' worker surplus is down here, this lower triangle. So to calculate the area of the worker surplus in the presence of these state-issued privileges and restrictions is the height of this triangle times the width of the triangle. So we'll come down here, do division by 2, and then I got the difference. The wage paid to each member of the guild is 85.3 less. The reservation wage or poverty wage of the first worker hired, 37.9. And then the number of hours that are supplied to the one factory town is 23,700. The height divided by 2 times 23,700 is the worker's surplus under the dual monopoly of the king. And it's dramatically lower than what would have been the case had these employees been free to supply their labor however they wanted, and firms to be free to enter and exit and compete against other people freely. So this decline is what Marx is talking about when he's saying that the corporatists exploit the workers by stealing their surplus. The corporatist, or the Marxian capitalist, include both the factory owner and the guild master. Both steal the surplus of the workers. This exploitation is intensified by state-sanctioned product monopolies. Because the factory owner is also the only licensed supplier of wool cloth, he enjoys a government-created and protected product monopoly. As the sole producer of wool cloth, a result of license issued by the state, the factory owner determines the quantity of wool cloth to supply where his marginal revenue equals his marginal cost. To find marginal revenue, we need to derive the factory owner's total revenue. Since he has decades of experience, he has an intuitive understanding of the most consumers can pay for various quantities of wool cloth. This intuitive feeling is modeled by the demand curve that was given up here. I'll just copy the numbers and the subtraction symbol, and then I'll press enter to make sure I got it right. What does P equal? It equals 41.9 minus 0.04 Q. If I multiply the right side of this equation by Q, like I'm doing here, I'm going to put 41.9 here, and I'm going to put 0.004. I distribute Q into here. I get the linear part of revenue, and I get the quadratic part of revenue. So this is the quadratic revenue equation from the firm selling refined wool as cloth. The factory owner's marginal revenue is found by differentiating his revenue equation with respect to Q. Doing that yields linear marginal revenue that has an intercept equal to the intercept of demand, 41.9, but is twice as steep. So we're going to multiply that by 2, and we get 0.008. With his state-protected monopoly on wool cloth, the factory owner, again a grandson of the royals, supplies how many pounds of wool? We have to go to the max product model. I've already entered the demand curve from my version of the problem and the supply curve. Now I got to enter the marginal revenue curve. So I'm going to copy this and paste it right here. And I'm going to change this to R for marginal revenue. Then I got to multiply that by 2 to make it twice as steep. So marginal revenue has the same intercept as demand, but it's twice as steep. So what the monopolist is going to do in the product market, it's going to maximize profits by setting marginal revenue equal to the supply curve. And so the monopolist wants to supply just 3,100 pounds of wool cloth. If he supplies just that amount of quantity, I'll change that to black, dashed with thickness of 1. If he supplies just that quantity, 3,100, he can charge a price as high as 29.5 pennies per pound of wool. Remember, the competitive price was much lower at 23.3. He restricts output to drive price up the demand curve of consumers. Now, he charges that price, even though he would be willing to supply that same quantity for as little as what? Well, he could supply that same quantity right here. The minimum price he'd be willing to supply that quantity is 17.1. So what is the monopolist doing? He reduces output to drive price up so that he can steal some of the consumer surplus. In the absence of a king-granted monopoly, consumer surplus is the triangle above the market clearing price, and the lower triangle is firm surplus. Type Y equal to the competitive price, which is 23.3. I'm going to change that to black dashed 1. I'm going to make this go away so we can see what the consumer surplus would be if there were no state-granted monopolies. The consumer surplus is this upper triangle with a height equal to the most the wealthiest person be willing to pay, a noble, 41.9. We're going to subtract off the price that person would pay if there were no monopolies created and protected by the crown. That'd be 23.3. We're going to multiply that by the quantity that would have prevailed had there been no monopolies and protections granted. The competitive output is 4,650. Then we have to divide that by 2 to get the consumer surplus would have been without state-granted monopoly power. So this is what consumer surplus would have been without state intervention. Because the king has granted this monopoly, we have to recompute it for this situation. So we have to turn the marginal revenue curve back on, and we have to set the quantity equal to 3,100, and the consumers are paying the higher price. So we have to raise this dotted line here up to the price that consumers are paying. They're paying $29.50. So consumer surplus has shrunk to the smaller triangle. The monopoly means people that were middle class are now among the poor. They were able to buy wool at this competitive price of $23.30 At this price of $29.50, they can no longer buy the wool. So they have to wear old ratty clothes because they can't afford this new price. And they join the poor. So the new consumer surplus is the difference in what the richest person in the kingdom will pay, the king or a noble or a merchant, minus what the monopoly charges, $29.50. And then the monopoly supplies only 3,100 pounds of wool. We got to divide that by 2 to get the area of a triangle. So consumer surplus drops to that. And it's even worse than that because remember what I said. The people who populate the demand curve from monopoly price, the competitive price, they were middle income people. They are now priced out of wool. They cannot buy wool in the kingdom. So the poor and the former middle class are now walking around with worn out woolen clothes. It got so bad in England that there were a lot of people walking without pants. And then the king made a law that said that every person who dies has to be buried in wool. Well, guess what happened? A bunch of people raided the graves to harvest the wool cloth that these bodies were buried in. This is a continuation of that exploitation that Marx was talking about, and I totally agree with him. But what Marx gets wrong, in my opinion, is he's critiquing this structure that the king has built around him to collect taxes. The king has created these monopolies in labor and in products, and he protects them from competition domestically and from foreign supplies through tariffs, quotas, and out bans. This blue area models the consumer surplus in the absence of the state creating and protecting monopolies for elites. Because of the state interventions, the crown creating and protecting monopolies for the elites, consumer surplus shrinks to this smaller triangle. And the price of the wool is 29.5, even though the firm would be willing to accept 17.1 per pound. This purple trapezoid represents the loss in consumer surplus that results from the state via the crown giving the elites monopoly powers both in product and labor markets. In the labor market, if there were no restrictions on workers, no restrictions on firms and workers could enter or exit whatever market they wanted to, then this would be the worker surplus. But this is what happens to worker surplus when the state, through the king, grants monopoly powers and protections from competitors, foreign and domestic, to the elites. The workers get paid the subsistence wage, and the guild masters, or the people that run this system, collect this in the form of fees from the workers. And then the owner of the factory in the one factory town collects this rectangle. So worker surpluses shrunk dramatically. And this blue trapezoid here represents the loss in worker surplus. And this is what Marx is talking about when he's talking about the workers aren't getting a surplus of their labor. They're being exploited. And I agree with him. But it's not a result, again, of these competitive markets. These markets are not competitive. They're highly regulated. Only certain people have rights to sell either labor or products. And the people who may want to compete against these privileged firms or guilds are locked out of the competition. So these guilds and corporations are free from competition. While the craftsmen of the guild toiled long hours for a subsistence wage of what? Remember, the wage paid to the worker was only 85.3 pennies per week. That is their reservation wage, in today's lingo, Marx's subsistence wage rate. Their guildmaster lived in an opulent home they passed each evening on their way from the factory to the shanty dwellings. Through his windows, they glimpsed imported furniture, ornate tapestries, and polished silver, luxuries paid for by their sweat. What had once been called a brotherhood had become a hierarchy. The guildmaster negotiated fees with the factory owner while enforcing wage suppression and obedience on his own members. Many craftsmen began to ask why their skill and effort yielded only enough to survive while their leader prospered under royal charters and state protection. The system enriched the guildmasters by binding the many to poverty, a living image of the exploitation Marx described as surplus value extracted through the course of social relations. Outraged, the guild members rose in protest. The state, invoking liberal reform and economic modernization, dismantled the guilds, but was striking outlawed, striking being workers striking their employers for higher wages and better working conditions. And the owner's monopoly still protected. The balance of power only shifted upward. The factory owner now stood alone as a sole employer. Under that assumption, I got to turn the red marginal expense equation back on to show that the monopoly buyer of labor, the owner of a factory in one factory town, will want to hire 23,700 hours of labor from former guild members, each still paid the subsistence rate of 85.3 pennies per week, even though he would have been willing to pay as much as what? 132.7 pennies for the same work. As a result, total worker surplus remained at what? The area of this triangle, which was 561,690 pennies per week. While the factory owner surplus, which he took from the guildmaster, this is the guildmaster's surplus, he grabbed that. So the factory owner's surplus is the trapezoid marked by these 4 points. When the guildmaster was equally powerful as the owner of the one factory town, this was the factory owner's surplus. This white rectangle was the guildmaster's surplus. This is what he extracted when he sold the labor to the one factory town. And this lower triangle was the worker's surplus, when the guild had equal power again. When the guild and the factory owner shared power in this labor market, the gray area was firm surplus. It is equal to the area of this triangle plus the area of that rectangle, which I'm going to calculate down here. The height of the gray triangle is the intercept of demand, 180.1, minus the maximum wage the factory would be willing to pay, 132.7. Multiplying that by the quantity, 23,700, and dividing by 2 gives the area of the gray triangle. Notice the area of this triangle here is equal to the area of this triangle here. That's because the slope of the demand curve and the slope of the supply curve are equal, except one's positive, one's negative. To the area of the gray triangle, we have to add the area of the gray rectangle. The height of this box is the 132.7 minus the competitive wage rate, which was 109. I need to put that in parentheses. And then I need to multiply that by the width of the box, which is 23,700. So this is what firm surplus was when the factory owner shared power with the guild. Now we're going to calculate what it is now. Because the guild master lost all power, the firm could now grab the guild master's surplus here. And so this gray trapezoid gets pushed further down to the subsistence wage of the worker. In order to do that, we have to change the height. We have to change this 109 in this gray box to the reservation wage of the last worker hired. So we're going to change this from 109 down to 85.3. So after the guild loses its power, the owner of that factory in the one factory town, his surplus is even larger. So the exploitation continues. It's just the state has gotten rid of the guildmaster. The guildmaster surplus is now transferred to the owner of the factory in the one factory town. This rectangle here is going to have the same area as this rectangle here. So I can multiply this rectangle by 2 in our equation to get the firm surplus. I'm multiplying this part by 2, and the new firm surplus is that value. Another way to do it would be to change this 109 to the 85.3, which is what the firm is paying workers. That's the subsistence wage. And you get the same exact number. Meanwhile, in the product market, the factory owner, still protected by his state-granted monopoly on wool cloth, continues to supply 3,100 pounds of wool cloth for the monopoly price of 29.5, even though he'd be willing to sell that same quantity for as little as 17.1 pennies per pound. The state's decision to preserve his monopoly privilege reduces consumer welfare, yielding a consumer surplus of only blank pennies per week, which is this green area, which we've already calculated at 19,220, compared to what it would have been under a competitive market free from state protection, which we had calculated at 43,245. The combined outcomes in the labor and product markets concentrate both the outrage of the workers and Marx's theoretical critique on the factory owner. An aristocratic capitalist who, through the coercive authority of the state, commands dual monopoly, one over labor and another over the goods produced by that labor. This fusion of political privilege and economic domination captures what Marx regarded as the essence of capitalist exploitation upheld by state power. Marx's capitalists are corporatists who benefit from state protections like licensing. For the remaining part of this lesson, read each paragraph and then answer the question that corresponds to each paragraph.